Thanks for being out here. Like you know, we are going to be talking about what happened this past Wednesday on July 27th, early Wednesday morning. I'm going to go ahead and give you some details a little bit right now. First of all, the suspect's name is Dalvin Hollands, D-A-L-V-I-N, last name of Hollands, H-O-L-L-I-N-S. He's a 19-year-old male. Currently, he was a Tempe resident as well. The officer, which we are going to be talking about, that was involved in this, is identified as Lieutenant Edward Ouimet. That's spelled O-U-I-M-E-T-T-E. He is 52 years old and has 19 years of service with the Tempe Police Department. On Wednesday, and I'm going to rehash a little bit of the information that happened. On Wednesday at about 9:07 in the morning, we received a 911 call from the Walgreens pharmacy located at Guadalupe and Rural Road. That 911 call was given that it was an armed robbery, that there was an individual that had just gone into the store. He had put on a ski mask and robbed the store with what was believed to be a handgun. The description that we had was a black male, 6 foot, thin build, wearing a dark shirt, gray sweats, sneakers, wearing a ski mask. What the investigation revealed is that when the suspect, who's been identified as Dalvin Hollands, entered the Walgreens, he walked near the bathrooms, at which point he put on a ski mask, went over to the pharmacy, at which time he jumped over the counter. When he jumped over the counter, he had a black bag. He began simulating as if he had a weapon by putting his hand in the bag, telling people, the victims, there were 3 victims behind the pharmacy, at which time he began threatening to kill them. He, at that point, demanded liquid narcotics. He stated he wanted a narcotic called high-tech, which has been identified as promethazine codeine. The victims handed over the liquid narcotics, and they, at that point, believed that he did have a handgun. Once he was given the liquid narcotics, Mr. Hollands left the Walgreens and fled on foot. There was a customer that attempted to follow Mr. Hollands. He began following a vehicle which happened to be the wrong vehicle, but gave some pertinent information. The information that was given to our officers, first of all, that this was a priority 0 call. Here in Tempe, what a priority 0 call is it's a violent crime that had just occurred. When we have a priority 0 call, any available unit, any available police officer responds to the scene. And those are all typically for violent crimes. The information that was given to the officers was that he was a black male, again, 6 foot, thin build, wearing a dark shirt, gray sweats, sneakers, wearing a ski mask, carrying a black bag. There was an officer that was coming to the scene. He was traveling southbound on Rural Road. When he was approaching Guadalupe, he saw an individual, Mr. Dalvin Hollands, at Guadalupe and Rural. This officer attempted to contact Mr. Hollands, got out of his vehicle, his patrol vehicle, and asked if he could speak with Mr. Hollands. Mr. Hollands stated he did not want to speak with the officer. As the officer attempted to go near Mr. Hollands at that point began running away from the officer. He began running northbound on Rural Road through the parking lot. At that point, Lieutenant Ouimet was approaching the scene of where the officer was. He was going westbound on Guadalupe, approaching Rural Road, when he also observed the Mr. Hollands. When Lieutenant Ouimet went to the area where Mr. Hollands was being contacted by the officer, he saw Mr. Hollands running from the officer, at which time Lieutenant Ouimet attempted to contact and get as close as he could to apprehend Mr. Hollands. Mr. Hollands at that point ran into a southern parking lot of the Senior Living Center right there at Westchester and Rural. When Mr. Hollands ran into that southern parking lot, he cut in towards the senior living facility. Lieutenant Ouimet jumped out of his vehicle and began chasing him on foot. At that point, Lieutenant Ouimet stated that Mr. Hollands began running towards a higher level care portion of the facility. There was actually an employee that saw Mr. Hollands running towards the door with a police officer chasing him. At that point, an employee hit a switch that locked the doors. At that point, Mr. Hollins continued to run westbound through the senior care facility, the outside of the care facility. At that point, Lieutenant Ouimet began paralleling the suspect, Mr. Hollins. He began yelling commands for Mr. Hollins to stop. Mr. Hollins did not stop, at which point Mr. Hollins turned towards Lieutenant Ouimet and pointed what Lieutenant Ouimet believed to be a gun. Lieutenant Ouimet at that point moved out of the way and fired one round, striking Mr. Hollins. Lieutenant Ouimet did not know at that point that he had shot the suspect and had hit the suspect, but Lieutenant Ouimet fell to the ground, injuring his arm. After being shot, Mr. Hollins then continued to run westbound through the parking area, through the facility, the exterior of the facility, and ran into a storage shed. When he ran into this storage facility, it's a maintenance shed. There were two maintenance workers that were currently in the shed at that point. They saw Mr. Hollins run into the shed. One of the employees was struck by Mr. Hollins as he was running into the shed. He was hit in the chest with the elbow, and both employees ran out. Both employees believed also that Mr. Hollins had a gun in his possession, as they stated, he had his hand in the bag as if he had a firearm. When they came out, they told the responding officers, where Mr. Hollins was at. They stated that they did believe Mr. Hollins had a firearm and that he was in a storage shed. There was a large police response. There were several people that lived in the facility there that were evacuated. When they were evacuated, they were taken to different portions, different areas, some of them to the Albertsons, some of them to another facility, and we also called in city buses to bring in as many people as possible. When the officers arrived, they were able to isolate where Mr. Hollins was at. He was in an area that he could not exit. There was only one entry and one exit. When Mr. Hollins was in there, we surrounded that area and we began making commands for him to come out. We began calling him out, trying to get any kind of response, which we did not get. It took about an hour for our tactical unit to get there. When our tactical unit did get there, they began putting other methods of getting in there, one of them being a robot. We sent a robot in there, at which point we did find Mr. Hollins unresponsive, and we attempted to contact him with our tactical team at that point. When we went in there, we saw that he was unconscious. We began medical treatment, called in the Tempe Fire Medical Rescue, at which time they came in and they pronounced him deceased. At this point, that's some of the information we have. Real quick, before I turn the time over to Chief Moir, you're going to get a CD. On this CD, there's going to be several pieces of information that many of you have requested, including the Walgreens pharmacy surveillance video of the robbery. There's a business surveillance video of Mr. Hollins walking down Guadalupe at Guadalupe and Rural. There's also 2 911 calls. One of them is from the Walgreens, the employees there that were robbed. There's also a 911 call from the witness. And in that witness call, you're going to hear that they were chasing the wrong car. Also, you're going to get attached the media release, as well as our Tempe Police body-worn camera policy and a photo of Lieutenant Ouimet. At this point, I am going to turn it over to Chief Sylvia Moir. If you have any questions, please hold them to the end, and we'll take a few at the end.
Thank you. So the events that bring us here test us as a community. First, as I said when I spoke with Mr. Holland's mother, Sarah, I expressed to her then, and I express it now, my profound sadness at the loss of her son. I have offered to meet with her and discuss everything that we know. She said at that time that she would consult the family and call me and let me know when it was a good time for her. I honored her wish. I have communicated with the men and women of the Tempe Police Department and told them that regardless of where the facts lead us, we must remain unafraid to fulfill our daily duty to safeguard Tempe. That people of Tempe, whether they live here, do business here, have fun here, study here, whatever brings them to Tempe, they're counting on us. We will, I told them, endure scrutiny, and we will learn from this tragedy, but we will learn humbly, and we will admit where we stumbled. I've committed to being the honest and open chief that Tempe and the profession of law enforcement deserve. In furtherance of this commitment, I will address some key questions and points of general interest to everyone. First, is following the shooting scene being stabilized? As described by Lieutenant Pooley, our investigation began immediately. 3 victims at the Walgreens robbery site, 1 victim assaulted by Mr. Holland at the adult living complex in the maintenance shed, and our Lieutenant Ouimet all perceived that Mr. Holland had and would use a firearm. Lieutenant Ouimet expressed that he was very concerned for the safety of the residents in that community as he made his decision to shoot. An extensive search was conducted and no firearm was recovered. Lieutenant Ouimet was wearing a body-worn camera. He was wearing it during this incident. However, our lieutenant did not turn on that camera, thus capturing Mr. Holland, who, while fleeing, turned toward Lieutenant Ouimet in a manner that Lieutenant Ouimet perceived as preparing to fire. It was in that moment that Lieutenant Ouimet had to respond. That was not captured on his body-worn camera. We have learned that the Maricopa County Medical Examiner will release a death certificate. That certificate will identify the cause and manner of death as a homicide due to a gunshot wound. The term homicide in this instance is a clinical term, and we should all refrain from reacting to that or considering it as a finding of criminal conduct. The trajectory, as reported by the medical examiner, of the single gunshot wound was back left to front right, which is consistent with the initial report and is not uncommon, as the media is well aware of in fluid and dynamic events and from the time from perception of a threat to reaction of a threat. While a finding such as this causes all of us some significant concern, we will continue to pursue a sound, unbiased, factual investigation. We will continue to release information, and we will continue to explore partnerships with outside entities to guarantee that our investigation is above reproach. As part of our open culture in the Tempe Police Department, I reached out to many in our community. I reached out to the family as I described. I reached out to some of our federal partners, including the DOJ, and I will continue to do so. I reached out to the family, and I'm giving them the honor of they will let me know when they are ready to have a face-to-face conversation about the events that took the life of their son. We know and we fully expect that you'll have questions, and as professionals, you understand that the investigation is ongoing. So we will answer a few of those questions as we can. Thank you.
Chief, can you please clarify, Lieutenant Pooley said that he turned toward the lieutenant and it appeared he was going to a weapon. You made a comment that he turned away, and that's...
Lieutenant Pooley can answer that question.
Yeah, right now what we know, we have interviewed Lieutenant Ouimet this morning. We did interview him. During his interview, he stated as he was paralleling Mr. Holland's, it appeared that Mr. Holland's turned towards him and had something in his hand which Lieutenant Ouimet believed to be a firearm. At that point is when Lieutenant Ouimet moved to try to get out of the way of what he believed was going to be a firearm, shot at him, and fired his duty weapon. He struck Mr. Holland's one time and fell to the ground, and Lieutenant Ouimet fell to the ground.
After careful review and looking at this, did you ever determine exactly what it was that this Mr. Holland was pointing at the officer? And part two is, do you know how far the officer was away, or the lieutenant was away from the guy when he actually fired the shot?
I don't have the exact measurements of the distance from the distance that Lieutenant Ouimet fired and the distance he was from Mr. Holland's, but I can tell you it was probably within 15 to 20 feet. It appeared that Lieutenant Wilmette, what he believed was a handgun, we still don't know. We know that he had his hand in a motion that he appeared to be a gun, but Lieutenant Wilmette, that's as much as he could tell us at this point.
Lieutenant, I'm sorry, you still didn't answer. I need clarification. You said he was turning towards him and what you appeared to be a gun. The chief said he was turning away, and that's why you got it back to front.
Correct. What Lieutenant Wilmette initially saw was Mr. Holland's turn towards Lieutenant Wilmette. By the time Lieutenant Wilmette began perceiving that there was a possible handgun, at that point, Mr. Holland's then turned back to turn away.
And why did the lieutenant fall to the ground? Did he just lose his balance? What caused him to fall?
Correct. He was trying to get out of the way what he believed was a threat to him, so which time he fell to the ground.
Lieutenant, there was never physical contact between the lieutenant.
Correct.
and-
There was not a physical contact. No, there wasn't.
And looking through Mr. Holland's bag, black bag, did you find anything of threatening nature, a knife, gun, any kind of, well, obviously you can find a gun, but anything that may have been threatening that he could have pointed that looked similar to what may have been a firearm, which is what the...
No, I don't have that information, no, but I can tell you we did not find a firearm in that bag. Not that I know of. I can tell you some of the evidence that we did find in the bag was related to the robbery, the liquid narcotics that was taken from the Walgreens.
Aside from the Walgreens victims, did the suspect ever threaten verbally to use a gun to anybody else, to the officers, to those maintenance workers?
No.
And did you say that the lieutenant, after firing the one shot, was not certain that he hit Mr.?
That's
Holland?
correct.
He knew he did.
Yes, after firing his firearm, he was not certain he had hit Mr. Holland's, and he had fallen to the ground. By the time the lieutenant got up, Mr. Holland's had already ran westbound and had gone out of sight.
Lieutenant, can you help me understand? So there wasn't physical contact, but he still fired his weapon. Why did he fire? I'm just trying to understand that.
After interviewing Lieutenant Wilmette, as Lieutenant Wilmette was chasing after the suspect, Mr. Holland's turned towards him with what Lieutenant Wilmette believed was a firearm. They were running parallel with each other. As Lieutenant Wilmette saw what he believed to be a firearm, that's at the time Lieutenant Wilmette fired his weapon one time.
So it was as the suspect was turning towards him.
Correct.
Was the lieutenant, did he have the information when he saw Mr. Holland's that he was a robbery suspect, or was it more that he saw something happening with another officer?
No, thank you for asking that. Just to clarify, so the information that the responding officers were given was that the suspect was involved in an armed robbery where what was believed to be a handgun was used in this robbery. The suspect description was a black male, 6 foot, thin build, wearing gray sweats with a dark shirt, carrying a black bag. When the first officer that contacted Mr. Holland's got to the area of Roland, Guadalupe, at that point is when I saw Mr. Holland's. Mr. Holland's was wearing gray sweats, he had no shirt on, and he had a black bag, what drew the attention to the officer. The officer attempted to contact him, at which time he tried to do a consensual contact, asked if he could speak to him. That point, Mr. Holland's ran from the officer.
So what made everybody believe he had a gun? He had his hand in the bag?
Correct. Yeah, from the time the 3 witnesses at the robbery saw Mr. Holland's, during that robbery, Mr. Holland's had his hand in the bag that appeared to be a gun. At one point during the robbery, Mr. Holland's actually pushed himself into one of the suspects, pushed himself into one of the back of the victims. That victim, in his statement, said he believed that Mr. Holland's had a gun and put it in his back. So you have 3 individuals that believed that Mr. Holland's had a gun. You had Lieutenant Wilmette, who then saw what he believed was a gun being pointed at him. And then you had 2 maintenance workers that also believed that Mr. Holland's had a gun. And each time of those witnesses, nobody saw an actual firearm, but they believed in the manner which Mr. Holland's was carrying himself, he was in possession of a handgun.
You said one of the 911 tapes that we're going to get is a caller saying you're chasing the wrong car. Can you explain that?
No, yeah, basically what happened is you had a customer that was inside the Walgreens. When he was inside the Walgreens, he saw Mr. Holland's running out. He knew he had just committed a crime, at which point he ran out after him. He got in his vehicle and he saw a white van leaving the area at a high rate of speed. At that point, he follows this white van onto the US 60 and gets other agencies involved, and we find out it's the wrong vehicle.
Did the lieutenant warn Mr. Hollins before he fired the shot?
Yes, he did. He was giving Mr. Hollins commands as he was yelling at him, and Mr. Hollins continued to run away.
Lieutenant, your agency arrested Mr. Hollins at the end of April for armed robbery. Can you tell me, has that report been turned over to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office? Because I haven't been able to find the charges. And if during that armed robbery that he was arrested for, was he in possession of a weapon?
I don't have all the information on that, Don. I'm still working on getting that. I'll have to get back with you on that. One more question and we'll be done.
Is there anything you can say about the lieutenant involved? We've heard some claims that he was actually on leave himself because of mental issues or anything like that. I don't know if you can dive into that.
That is, I can tell you that Lieutenant Woodmet was on leave, but as far as mental issues, that is completely false and inaccurate. And that's all we have right now. So I don't have that either right now. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys after. Yep, thanks.